my name is Lottie and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in March, which is really exciting. This is like my first wrap-up video on this channel, so I'm really excited to be sharing it with you. I don't have a lot to physically hold up and show you because I read quite a lot of digital books this month, but before we go into the books that I read and what I thought about them, I just wanted to run you through some stats. So I read 6 books in total this month. Not my best reading month so far, but those 6 books did accumulate to 2,599 pages, so that's pretty cool. In terms of star ratings, I read 2 3 stars, 1 4 star and 3 4.5 stars, so I think that's pretty good. Nothing was quite a 5-star for me, but I was coming off of February where I did read 3 5-star books, but they were all part of the same series, so I don't think that could really count. But I think I was just sort of hoping for something that I loved quite as much as when I read the Nevernight trilogy. So I think I'm like not in a slump, but just sort of chasing that feeling. I had quite a mixed bag this month. For age groups, I read 4 YA, a middle grade and an adult novel. Formats, I only read 1 physical book. I read 4 ebooks and 1 audiobook, and one of my reasonings for that is because I had planned to read mostly digital this month because I've just moved house, so everything was packed away, so I had literally 1 book that I kept out for the month that I was like, that's a book that I definitely want to read that I don't have a digital copy of. And my genres were really mixed. I read 2 contemporaries this month, but everything else was just really mishmash. I read a horror, I read a dystopian, I read 2 fantasies, 1 was a fantasy romance. And in terms of reading library books versus books I already own, it was an even ratio, so I read 3 library books and 3 books that I have in my collection. So I'm going to be talking through the books in star rating order as opposed to chronologically, which is what my instinct is, but I think this would be more fun. So I'm going to start off with the physical book that I read this month, which was 3 stars, and that is The Sacrifice by Charlie Higson. This is the 4th book in the Enemy series, which is a YA horror dystopian story. It's set in London, or like around the present day, and essentially what's happened is there's been this kind of like parasite or disease that has turned everyone over the age of 14 into like a zombie crazy child eating monster. So the series follows a bunch of different kids all across London who are basically just surviving, and it's the story of how that they interact with each other, the politics systems that they set up on their own, and also finding out how this pandemic apocalypse has happened and how they are going to stop the growing threat of the adults. The adults are all called different things according to the different groups of children, so they're called strangers, they're called zombies, they're called lots of things. I can't remember them because there's so many different names. The groups of children that we all follow is sort of different for each book. So the first book we follow a group of kids who lived in an old Waitrose and they make their way to Buckingham Palace. The second book is set a year before the first book, so we're following a group of kids then, and the journey of like how they came to be at like the first book, they sort of all tie in together. And then the third book happens just before this book is set. It's set around 8 days before then, so that's following another group of kids, and then this book is following a different group of kids who correlate to the group of kids in the third book. It all sounds really complicated, but when you're reading it, it makes a lot of sense. This is probably one of my absolute favourite series. It's not something that I would think, yes, I would love that, but it is really, really intriguing, and I love seeing how the different groups of kids interact with each other. So we've got one group who live at Buckingham Palace, and he calls himself the king, the leader of them. And then there's another group that live at Parliament, and the leader of that calls herself the Prime Minister. And then there's another group of kids who live at the Tower of London and their leader calls himself a general. And then there's another group at the Natural History Museum, and it's just I love seeing how they all interact with each other. This book follows the children from the second book, so we're sort of seeing their follow-up after we found them coming to the Tower of London. So in terms of like my actual opinions on this installment in the series, it's kind of difficult to talk about because obviously I've started this series before I started my channel, so you haven't seen me give my that's the doorbell. So you haven't seen me give my opinions on earlier books in the series. The thing about this series is it's really action-packed. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of perspectives. And I think the problem with this book is it was essentially a catch-up book to try and get all the players into the right place for the series to continue. So we were following 3 or 4 perspectives. The series is told in third person, but you sort of follow like each kid or group of kids depending on where they are in London. The problem that I think was this book, because there was so many perspectives, it was really difficult for the plot to actually advance much. So there was quite a lot of action going on but not a lot happening in terms of what's going on in London, what's happening with the adults, what's happening with the the children and the tension between the different groups living across London. There were a few scenes in this that I really enjoyed and were really tense and really exciting. This is a high stakes series. Your favourite characters will die. Fortunately, there wasn't a lot of drama in that sense in this book, but maybe that was one of the reasons why I didn't like it, because it wasn't as high stakes, because it was just getting everyone into place for something really big that I think is going to happen in the next book. So I only gave this 3 stars, but the previous book in the series was my favourite so far in the series, so I think it's sort of like following up from that. But I'm really hoping that The Fallen, which I think is the next book, is a lot more, I don't know, it's not entertaining, because this was entertaining, but there's just more going on when we're learning more about what's happening. I think one of the problems I had with this book as well, the kids themselves are learning stuff that we, the reader, already know, because we've already followed a different perspective in the previous book. So it's sort of they're catching up to what happened then, and we already know that this has happened, so it was a bit repetitive in that sense. I did read this as part of Becca's Bookoplathon, but I only read about 100 pages of it for the Bookoplathon, and I had to finish it afterwards. It took me a really, really long time to finish it, which was a bit like, ugh. But I think that's just because I might have had a bit of burnout from the readathon. The other 3-star book that I read this month was Wonder by R.J. Palacio. This is a contemporary middle grade book about a young boy called Oggy who has a genetic disorder that has made his face quite disfigured, and he also has hearing problems. He's had to have a lot of surgeries in his younger life to make him healthy, essentially, and make him have a life that is a good quality of life. I did really enjoy this book, but it didn't have much of an impact on me. I think it's probably just because it's middle grade though, rather than it being a bad book. I just wasn't as invested in it as I wanted to be. I did really, really love all the characters in the story of Oggy. It's essentially following him going to school for the first time. He's just starting middle school and he's never been to school before because he was homeschooled. It's a really sweet book. It didn't blow me away, but it's just like a really lovely, heartwarming read. There's a line in it where Oggy says to his mom, like, why do I have to be so ugly? And that broke my heart, because no kid should ever feel like that. My takeaway message from this book was to be kind, and also that just because someone is different doesn't mean that they are different. The book starts with Oggy saying, like, he's just an ordinary kid, but he looks different, and everyone seems to think that he's extraordinary when he's like, I just like playing Xbox and playing with my dog, you know? He's just like an ordinary kid. I did watch the movie shortly after I read the book. It's on Netflix if you are interested in watching it, and I did really enjoy the movie. The movie is essentially the same as the book. There wasn't many differences in it that I noticed. The 4-star book that I read this month was Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Seanan McGuire. This is the second book in the Wayward Children series, which is a series of novellas about children who are able to go to a portal world. It's a portal fantasy series, and this book in particular follows Jack and Jill, who are 2 twin girls from the first book, and this is essentially the story of their portal world and how they find their portal world, what happens to them in their portal world, and then how they leave their portal world. Quite difficult to talk about this book because it is so short, and I always feel like when I start the book, like, it's paced really well. I feel this about the first book in the series as well, where it's like it was paced really well, and I think, oh yeah, this book is like the perfect length, it doesn't need to be any longer, and then I get to the end of the book and I wish that I had more. The story of Jack and Jill in their portal world, like, it spans quite a long period of their life. We start with their birth, and then when they go into their portal world at like 11, 12 years old, and they leave when they're like 18. The amount of time that we are following Jack and Jill for, you could write an entire series about what happened to them in this portal world. But obviously, because it's a novella and it's just like a snapshot of what's happened to these girls in their life, there's a lot of information there that isn't there. In this book, I really enjoyed the atmosphere and the world building, but again, I just wish that there had been more. That's why I gave it 4 stars rather than like a 4.5 or a 5. It was great, but I just needed more to hit that mark. The thing about this book as well is I didn't enjoy it as much as I enjoyed the first book, Every Heart a Doorway. It definitely felt like it was just like a catch-up book. This is something that's happened to Jack and Jill before their story in Every Heart a Doorway, but it wasn't necessarily information we needed to know about them. It was just like a nice backstory. I read Down Among the Sticks and Bones for Becca's Bookoplathon. That was like my main book for that TBR, and I did manage to read it for the whole of the Bookoplathon. It was the first book that I started and finished during the readathon. So I feel like the next natural progression would be to talk about the second book that I read during that readathon, and that was Noughts and Crosses by Malorie Blackman. This is a 4.5 star read for me. I listened to the audiobook because I managed to grab it on my library's app when I was looking for a book to meet a couple of the prompts for the readathon, and I'm really glad that I decided to read this book. It's a series that has been on my radar for a really long time, like literally since I was a kid. It's the sort of book that is always in like school libraries. I sort of knew what it was, but I didn't really know what it was about. It's essentially set in the present day, but it's like an alternate history that has led to a sort of dystopian world. Instead of white people and European people going to colonize like Africa and South America, it's essentially Africa has gone and colonized the rest of the world. So black people are in power, there was enslavement of white people in the history of this world, and currently there's like segregation. For example, white people have to go to their own schools and black people have their own schools, and then the white people aren't, they're supposed to leave education at 14, I think. There's like no higher education, which is, you know, how it used to be with black and white people in the real world, obviously just the other way around. So it's like, it is a dystopian, but I don't like calling it a dystopian because it's basically what our world was and still in parts is like now, but I guess you could say that is a dystopian society anyway. So but basically Noughts and Crosses follows Callum, who is a Nought. Yes, Callum, who is it's trying to remember which way around it is. Callum, who is a Nought, and Sephi, who is a Cross. Callum is white and Sephi is black, and Sephi is the daughter of the Prime Minister, or he's like a very influential politician, and then Callum's just like a lad living on a council estate essentially. His mom used to be a housekeeper for Sephi's family, and that's how the two of them met. They were really good friends when they were children. They sort of wanted to continue that friendship as they got older. Obviously it's kind of not really allowed because one is white and one is black. Callum is able to get into a very prestigious school which is mainly for black people, but they're starting to allow mixing. He's one of the first Noughts to go to a cross school. It's basically a Romeo and Juliet retelling where it's like two, not feuding, but two separate societies, families, etc. I really loved their relationship. It was so sweet, and there's even a balcony scene, so you know, that's how you know it's Romeo and Juliet. Yeah, the book is full of drama and action. I listened to it all in one day. It's like a 500-page book and I listened to it all in one day because I was just hooked. I'm like trying to get my hands on the next books in the series as soon as I can because I loved this book. This is again really high stakes. I don't want to say any spoilers, but it was like really shocking, a lot of the things that happened in it. I was just like, I couldn't believe it. I was like gasping and like, oh my god, all the way through. I obviously gave it 4.5 stars, so there was something about it that didn't quite hit the mark for me, and I think that might be just because of the way in which I consumed it. So because I listened to it on an audiobook and I read it all in one day, whereas I think if I'd have the time to savour it and really, I don't know, like just absorb what was the information that was being presented to me, it might have been a 5-star. I think if I was to reread it, I might end up bumping it up to 5 stars. Next, I want to talk about Loveless by Alice Oseman. This was actually the first book that I read this month. It was another 4.5 star for me. This was my first Alice Oseman book, and I have obviously heard quite a lot about Alice Oseman on BookTube, mostly about her Heartstopper graphic novel series. Loveless is her newest release. It follows a girl called Georgia and her friends as they are starting their first year of university. Georgia is really unsure of her sexuality and her romantic feelings towards other people, so she's never kissed anyone, she's never had a boyfriend, and she's really like insecure about that, and she's like, is there something wrong with me? The story follows her journey to accepting herself as an asexual and an aromantic person. So there was the like LGBTQ plus side of the story that drew me in because I'm really interested in reading those sorts of stories. What I really loved about this book was the first year of university experience. The gang go to Durham University, which is like nothing like the university that I went to. You know, first year experience is like all the same. You know, you have freshers week, you go to society meetings, you are living in halls and it's really weird, and there's people having sex in the kitchen. It just made me yearn for university again. And there was at the very beginning of it, when they are like first starting, you know, uni and like having their introductions and things, I was like, oh my god, like I can't read this because it's making me really sad. Like my uni experience was cut short essentially because of the pandemic, so it was just like, I hate this. It was so good. I loved it so much. I love all the characters. The sapphic romance in it was like, yes, I love that. It was just a really, really good book, and it just made me like want to go back to university. And there was so many things about it as well that I could really relate to, because obviously in the UK we don't really like have roommates when we're at uni. You tend to just have your own room that you don't have to share. Georgia and like one of the main characters, whose name completely has slipped my mind, they end up having to be roommates. I didn't have that experience, but someone I used to know did, so it was really like familiar to me in that sense because they had a roommate, and it was like really strange because it was really unusual for that to happen. And it's like I could completely relate to that because I know people who have had roommates going to the club for the first time, and it's like you hype it up in your head and it's actually like completely crap. It's like, yep, can relate. I just found this a really relatable book, and I think that's why I loved it so much. It was just the whole uni experience of it that really hit home for me. Now it's time to talk about the big one. And I'm not just talking about the length of the book. This month I read A Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J Maas, which is the 4th/5th book in the A Court of Thorns and Roses series. 4.5 stars for me. I'm not going to bother trying to explain what this book is about because it is like so late in the series, and I feel like everybody on BookTube knows what this series is about. I feel like I don't really have much to contribute to the conversation either. Like a lot of what everybody else has already said, I also have the same feelings. It's very character driven, there's not a lot of plot going on, the smut is top tier, I loved it. I do read this series for the smut in it, I'm not gonna lie. Like there's very little about it that's actually holding my attention other than the romance and the sexy scenes. But I do like the fantasy elements of it. There wasn't a lot of plot, not a lot in that sense going on in this book, but I didn't mind that much because I love reading character-driven contemporaries. They are some of my absolute favourite books, and this basically felt like a character-driven fantasy where we just got to spend some more time with the characters in it. And some of my favourite things is seeing friendships and relationships develop in books. I love seeing that dynamic between characters. So seeing Nesta and Cassian's relationship develop was great, and seeing Nesta develop her friendships was great, and seeing Nesta coming out of her shell was great. I didn't mind that there was a lack of plot because I don't read this series for the plot. Like there are much better fantasies out there if you were looking for like a high fantasy political plot thing. This series to me is just like a not a guilty pleasure because I don't feel guilty about anything that I read. Something I definitely read for me and for my own enjoyment, and not because anybody else has told me, oh, you should read this because of XYZ. I have no idea what I'm on about. This book obviously has trigger warnings for like PTSD and discussions of sexual assault and sexual violence, and it was actually quite difficult to read. I mean, I think it would be difficult to read about in general, but it was quite difficult to read when I was reading it because I was actually reading it the week that the news about Sarah Everard and the protests were happening. So it was like really topical because like it's in my book and it's in my real life. This book was like a solid 4/4.5 for me. I wanted to bump it up because I did really enjoy it while I was reading it, and then like looking back I'm like, did I actually enjoy it that much? But I did enjoy it that much. I kind of lost interest about halfway through, and I think that's because I feel like these books are too long. Like this book was way too long. I think the last book was like way too long. It's been a couple of years since I read the original trilogy, so I'd actually forgotten quite a lot of plot points that had happened, and it wasn't that difficult to catch up because obviously there wasn't a lot of plot happening in this book. But I wasn't bored, but I did start to lose interest and lose momentum about halfway through because it is so long. And there's nothing wrong with long books, but I don't know. Clearly there was something about it that I just was like, I'm not that bothered. That was all the books that I read this month. I really hope that this video is coherent and makes sense and also somewhat entertaining because I feel like I've been talking for ages without actually saying anything of import. I also did actually want to show you my like reading progress this month. So every month in my bullet journal I do a spread like this where I have a stack of blank books and then a chart where I colour in how many pages that I've read that day, and each colour corresponds to a book that I've read. Obviously I have some here that aren't here. This is just a book that I started but I didn't finish in the month, which is why I haven't talked about it. I did read quite a lot this month in terms of like each day. I would read quite a lot. There are very few days where I read less than 50 pages, but there are also quite a few days where I didn't read anything at all, which is why I think that I was only able to read 6 books this month compared to February, whether I read more books, but I also read like more days of the month. I also read quite a lot of short books in February to try and make up for the fact that it took me 3 weeks to finish Nevernight, so I also think that I had quite a rocky reading month just because I have been quite busy with my move. Like I had a rocky start to April, but we'll talk about that in my April wrap up. Yeah, obviously I don't have a lot to hold up and show you, so there's obviously the physical book that I read this month, and I'll show you my Kindle because there's nothing else for me to show you. I don't think I have anything else left to say, so if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I am going to try and get into the swing of things because I really do want to give my channel a proper good go. Just in case you're wondering, which you probably weren't, I am not going to be doing TBR videos. I love watching TBR videos, especially TBR games, but I'm not going to be making them because I found that I cannot read to a schedule. I like to read books if I want to do like a read along, for example, so I'll be like, oh, I'll try and read that this month, but I'm very much a mood reader and I don't want to do like TBR videos and say I have to read these books this month and then find out I don't want to read them at all. So my wrap-ups will be a surprise, which I hope you enjoy. Goodbye. Thank you for watching. Hopefully see you soon.